Hi, today we're continuing our read of Books of Blood, Volume 3. We are on our last two stories. Today's is Scape-Goats, which is an interesting one. It wasn't a real island the tide had carried us onto. It was a lifeless mound of stones. Calling a hunchbacked shit pile like this an island is flattery. Islands are oases in the sea, green and abundant. This is a forsaken place, no seals in the water around it, no birds in the air above it. I can think of no use for a place like this except that you could say of it, I saw the heart of nothing and survived. It's not on any of the charts, said Ray, poring over the map of the Inner Hebrides, his nail at the spot where he'd calculated that we should be. It was, as he'd said, an empty space on the map, just pale blue sea without the merest speck to sign the existence of this rock. It wasn't just the seals and the birds that ignored it then. The chart makers had too. There were one or two arrows in the vicinity of Ray's finger, marking the currents that should have been taking us north. Tiny red darts on a paper ocean. The rest, like the world outside, was deserted. Jonathan was jubilant, of course, once he discovered that the place wasn't even to be found on the map. He seemed to feel instantly exonerated. The blame for our being here wasn't his any longer. It was the map makers. He wasn't going to be held responsible for us being beached if the mound wasn't even marked from the charts. The apologetic expression he'd worn since our unscheduled arrival was replaced with a look of self-satisfaction. You can't avoid a place that doesn't exist, can you? He crowed. Can you? You could have used the eyes God gave you, Ray flung back at him, but Jonathan wasn't about to be cowed by reasonable criticism. It was so sudden, Raymond, he said. In this mist I didn't have a chance. It was on top of us before I knew it. It had been sudden. No two ways about it. I'd been in the galley preparing breakfast, which had become my responsibility since neither Angela nor Jonathan showed any enthusiasm for the task, when the hull of the Emmanuel grated on shingle, then plowed her way juddering up onto the stony beach. There was a moment's silence, then the shouting began. I climbed up out of the galley to find Jonathan standing on deck, grinning sheepishly, waving his arms around to semaphore his innocence. Before you ask, he said, I don't know how it happened. One minute we were just coasting along. Oh, Jesus, all fucking mighty, Ray was clambering out of the cabin, hauling a pair of jeans on as he did so, and looking much the worse for a night in a bunk with Angela. I had the questionable honor of listening to her orgasms all night. She was certainly demanding. Jonathan began his defense speech again from the beginning. Before you ask, but Ray silenced him with a few choice insults. I retreated into the confines of the galley while the argument raged on deck. It gave me no small satisfaction to hear Jonathan slanged. I even hoped Ray would lose his cool enough to bloody that perfect hook nose. The galley was a slop bucket. The breakfast I'd been preparing was all over the floor, and I left it there, the yolks of the eggs, the gammon, and the French toast all congealing in pools of spilt fat. It was Jonathan's fault. Let him clear it up. I poured myself a glass of grapefruit juice, waited until the recriminations died down, and went back up. It was barely 2 hours after dawn, and the mist that had shrouded this island was from Jonathan's view still covered in the sun. If today was anything like the week we'd had so far, by noon the deck would be too hot to step on barefoot. But now, and the mist was still thick, I could feel cold wearing just the bottom of my bikini. It didn't matter much, sailing amongst the islands, what you wore. There was no one to see you. I got the best all-over tan I ever had. But this morning the chill drove me back below to find a sweater. There was no wind, the cold was coming out from the sea. There was still night down there, I thought, just a few yards off the beach, limitless night. I pulled on a sweater and went back on deck. The maps were out and Ray was bending over them. His bare back was peeling from an excess of sun, and I could see the bald patch he tried to hide in his dirty yellow curls. Jonathan was staring at the beach and stroking his nose. Christ, what a place, he said. He glanced at me, trying to smile. He had this illusion, poor Jonathan, that his face could charm a tortoise out of its shell, and to be fair to him, there were a few women who melted if he so much as looked at him. I wasn't one of them, and it irritated him. I'd always thought his Jewish good looks too bland to be beautiful. My indifference was a red rag to him. A voice, sleepy and pouty, drifted up from below deck. Our lady of the bunk was awake at last, time to make her late entrance, coyly wrapping a towel around her nakedness as she emerged. Her face was puffed up with too much red wine, and her hair needed a comb through. Still, she turned on the radiance, eyes wide. Shirley Temple with cleavage. What's happening, Ray? Where are we? Ray didn't look up from his computations, which earned him a frown. We've got a bloody awful navigator, that's all, he said. I don't even know what happened, Jonathan protested, clearly hoping for a show of sympathy from Angela. None was forthcoming. But where are we? She asked again. Good morning, Angela, I said. I, too, was ignored. Is it an island? She asked. Of course it's an island. I just don't know which one yet, Ray replied. Perhaps it's Bara, she suggested. Ray pulled a face. We're nowhere near Bara, he said. Now, if you'll just let me retrace our steps in the sea. Geez, just Ray's Jesus fixation, I thought, looking back at the beach. It was impossible to guess how big the place was. The mist erased the landscape after 100 yards. Perhaps somewhere in that gray wall there was a human habitation. Ray, having located the blank spot on the map where we were supposedly stranded, climbed down onto the beach and took a critical look at the bow. More to be out of Angela's way than anything else, I climbed down to join him. The round of stones on the beach were cold and slippery on the bare soles of my feet. Ray smoothed his palm down on the side of the Emmanuel, almost a caress, then crouched to look at the damage to the bow. I don't think we're holed, he said, but I can't be sure. We'll float off come high tide, said Jonathan, posing on the bow, hands on hips. No sweat, he winked at me. No sweat at all. Will we shit float off? Ray snapped. Take a look for yourself. Then we'll get some help to haul us off. Jonathan's confidence was unscathed. And you can damn well fetch someone, you asshole. Sure, why not? Give it an hour or so for the fog to shift, and I'll take a walk. Find some help. He sauntered away. I'll put on some coffee, Angela volunteered. Knowing her, that'd take an hour to brew. There was time for a stroll. I started along the beach. Don't go too far, love, Ray called. No, love, he said. Easy word. He meant nothing by it. The sun was warmer now, and as I walked, I stripped off the sweater. My bare breasts were already brown as 2 nuts, and I thought about as big. Still, I can't have everything. At least I'd got 2 neurons in my head to rub together, which was more than could be said for Angela. She had tits like melons and a brain that'd shame a mule. The sun wasn't getting through the mist properly. It was filtering down the island fitfully, and its light flattened everything out, draining the place of color and weight, reducing the sea and the rocks of the rubbish on the beach to one bleached out gray, the color of overboiled meat. After only 100 yards, something about the place began to depress me, so I turned back. On my right, tiny, lisping waves crept up to the shore and collapsed with a weary, plopping sound of the stones. No majestic rollers here, just the rhythmical slop, slop, slop of an exhausted tide. I hated the place already. Back at the boat, Ray was trying the radio, but for some reason all he could get was a blanket of white noise on every frequency. He cursed it a while, then gave up. After half an hour, breakfast was served, though we had to make do with sardines, tinned mushrooms, and the remains of the French toast. Angela served his feast with her usual aplomb, looking as though she was performing a second miracle with loaves and fishes. It was all but impossible to enjoy the food anyway. The air seemed to drain all the taste away. Funny, isn't it? Began Jonathan. Hilarious, said Ray. There's no foghorns, mist but no horns, not even the sound of a motor. Weird. He was right. Total silence wrapped us up, a damp and smothering hush. Except for the apologetic slop of the waves and the sound of our voices, we might as well have been deaf. I sat on the stern and looked at the empty sea. It was still gray, but the sun was beginning to strike other colors in it now, a somber green and deeper, a hint of blue-purple. Below the boat I could see strands of kelp and maiden's hair, toys to the tide, swaying. It looked inviting, and anything was better than the sour atmosphere at the Emmanuel. I'm going for a swim, I said. I wouldn't, love, Ray replied. Why not? The current that threw us up here must be pretty strong. You don't want to get caught in it. But the tide's still coming in. I'd only be swept back to the beach. You don't know what cross currents there are out there, whirlpools even. They're quite common, suck you down in a flash. I looked out at the sea again. It looked harmless enough, but then I'd read that these were treacherous waters and thought better of it. Angela had started a little sulking session because nobody had finished her immaculately prepared breakfast. Ray was playing up to it. He loved babying her, letting her play damn stupid games. It made me sick. I went below to do the washing up, tossing the slops out of the porthole into the sea. They didn't slink immediately. They floated in an oily patch, half-eaten mushrooms and slivers of sardines bobbing around on the surface, as though someone had thrown up in the sea. Food for crabs, if any self-respecting crab condescended to live here. Jonathan joined me in the galley, obviously still feeling a little foolish despite the bravado. He stood in the doorway trying to catch my eye while I pumped up some cold water into the bowl and half-heartedly rinsed the greasy plastic plates. All he wanted was to be told I didn't think this was his fault, and yes, of course, he was a kosher Adonis. I said nothing. Do you mind if I lend a hand? He said. There's not really room for two, I told her, trying not to sound too dismissive. He flinched nevertheless. This whole episode had punctured his self-esteem more badly than I'd realized, despite his strutting around. Look, I said gently, why don't you go back on deck, take in the sun before it gets too hot? I feel like a shit, he said. It was an accident. An utter shit. Like you said, we'll float off with the tide. He moved out of the doorway and down into the galley. His proximity made me feel almost claustrophobic. His body was too large for the space, too tanned, too assertive. I said there wasn't any room, Jonathan. He put his hand on the back of my neck, and instead of shrugging it off, I let it stay there, gently massaging the muscles. I wanted to tell him to leave me alone, but the lassitude of the place seemed to have gotten my system. His other hand was palm down on my belly, shoving up to my breast. I was indifferent to these ministrations. If he wanted this, he could have it. Above deck, Angela was gasping in the middle of a giggling fit, almost choking on her hysteria. I could see her in my mind's eye, throwing back her head, shaking her hair loose. Jonathan had unbuttoned his shorts and had let them drop. The gift of his foreskin to God had been neatly made. His erection was so hygienic in its enthusiasm it seemed incapable of the least harm. I let his mouth stick to mine, let his tongue explore my gums, insistent as a dentist's finger. He slid my bikini down far enough to get access, fumbled to position himself, then pressed it in. Behind him the stair creaked, and I looked over his shoulder in time to glimpse Ray bending at the hatch and staring down at Jonathan's buttocks and at the tangle of our arms. Did he see, I wondered, that I felt nothing? Did he understand that I did this dispassionately and could only have felt a twinge of desire if I had substituted his head, his back, his cock for Jonathan's? Soundlessly, he withdrew it from the stairway. A moment passed in which Jonathan said he loved me, then I heard Angela's laughter begin again as Ray described what he'd just witnessed. Let the bitch think whatever she pleased. I didn't care. Jonathan was still working at me with deliberate but uninspired strokes, a frown on his face like that of a schoolboy trying to solve some impossible equation. Discharge came without warning, signaled only by a tightening of his hold on my shoulders and a deepening of his frown. His thrust slowed and stopped. His eyes found mine for a flustered moment. I wanted to kiss him, but he lost all interest. He withdrew still hard, wincing. I'm always sensitive when I come, he murmured, hauling his shorts up. Was it good for you? I nodded. It was laughable. The whole thing was laughable. Stuck in the middle of nowhere with this little boy of 26 and Angela and a man who I didn't care lived or died. But then perhaps neither did I. I thought for no reason of the slops of the sea bobbing around, waiting for the next wave to catch them. Jonathan had already retreated up the stairs. I boiled up some coffee, standing, staring out of the porthole, and feeling his cum dry to a corrugated pearliness on the inside of my thigh. Ray and Angela had gone by the time I'd brewed the coffee, off for a walk in the island apparently, looking for help. Jonathan was sitting in my place at the stern, gazing out at the mist. More to break the silence than anything, I said, I think it's lifted a bit. Has it? I put a mug of black coffee beside him. Thanks. Where are the others? Exploring. He looked round to me, confusion in his eyes. I still feel like shit. I noticed the bottle of gin on the deck beside him. Bit early for drinking, isn't it? Want some? It's not even 11. Who cares? He pointed out to sea. Follow my finger, he said. He leaned over the shoulder and I did as he asked. No, you're not looking at the right place. Follow my finger. See it? Nothing. At the edge of the mist, it appears and disappears. There! Again! I did see something in the water, 20 or 30 yards from the Emmanuel's stern, brown-colored, wrinkled, turning over. It's a seal, I said. I don't think so. The sun's warming up the sea. They're probably coming in to bask in the shallows. It doesn't look like a seal. It rolls in a funny way. Maybe it's a piece of flotsam. Could be. He wiggled deeply from the bottle. Leave some for tonight. Yes, Mother. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just the waves on the beach, slop, slop, slop. Once in a while, the seal, or whatever it was, broke surface, rolled, and disappeared again. Another hour, I thought, and the tide will begin to turn, float us off this little afterthought of creation. Hey! Angela's voice from a distance. Hey, you guys! You guys, she called us. Jonathan stood up and hand up to his face against the glare of sunlit rock. It was much brighter now and getting hotter all the time. She's waving to us, he said, disinterested. Let her wave. You guys, she screeched, her arms waving. Jonathan cupped his hands around his mouth and bawled a reply. What do you want? Come and see, she replied. She wants us to come and see. I heard. Come on, he said. Nothing to lose. I didn't want to move, but he hauled me up by the arm. It wasn't worth arguing. His breath was inflammable. It was difficult making our way up the beach. The stones were not wet with seawater, but covered in a slick film of gray-green algae, like sweat on a skull. Jonathan was having even more difficulty getting across the beach than I was. Twice he lost his balance and fell heavily on his backside, cursing. The seat of his shorts was soon a filthy olive color, and there was a tear where his buttocks showed. I was no ballerina, but I managed to make it step by slow step, trying to avoid the large rocks so that if I slipped, I wouldn't have far to fall. Every few yards, we'd have to negotiate a line of stinking seaweed. It was able to jump them with reasonable elegance, but Jonathan, pissed and uncertain of his balance, plowed through them, his naked feet completely buried in the stuff. It wasn't just kelp. There was the usual detritus washed up on any beach, the broken bottles, the rusting Coke cans, the scum-stained cork, globs of tar, fragments of crabs, pale yellow Durex. And crawling over these stinking piles of dross were inch-long, fat-eyed blue flies, hundreds of them, clambering over the shit and over each other, buzzing to be alive and alive to be buzzing. It was the first life we'd seen. I was doing my best not to fall on my face as I stepped across one of these lines of seaweed when a little avalanche of pebbles began off to my left. 3, 4, 5 stones were skipping over each other towards the sea and setting another dozen stones moving as they jumped. There was no visible cause for the effect. Jonathan didn't even bother to look up. He was having too much trouble staying vertical. The avalanche stopped, run out of energy. Then another, this time between us and the sea, skipping stones bigger this than the last, and gaining more height than this as they left. The sequence was longer than before. It knocked stone into stone until a few pebbles actually reached the sea at the end of the dance. Plop. Dead noise. Plop. Plop. Ray appeared from behind one of the big boulders at the height of the beach, beaming like a loon. There's life on Mars, he yelled, and ducked away the way he'd come. A few more perilous moments and we reached him, the sweat sticking our hair to our foreheads like caps. Jonathan looked a little sick. What's the big deal? He demanded. Look what we found, said Ray, and led the way beyond the boulders. The first shock. Once we got to the height of the beach, we were looking down to the other side of the island. There was more of the same drab beach than sea. No inhabitants, no boats, no sign of human existence. The whole place couldn't have been more than a half-mile across, barely the back of a whale. But there was some life here. That was the second shock. In the sheltering ring of the large bald boulders which crowned the island was a fenced-in compound. The posts were rotting in the salt air, but a tangle of rusted barbed wire had been round between them to form a primitive pen. Inside the pen was a patch of coarse grass, and on this pitiful lawn stood 3 sheep and Angela. She was standing in the penal colony, stroking one of the inmates and cooing at his blank face. Sheep, she said triumphantly. Jonathan was there before me with his snapped remarks. So what? Well, it's strange, isn't it? Said Ray. 3 sheep in the middle of a little place like this? They don't look well to me, said Angela. She was right. The animals were the worse for their exposure to the elements. Their eyes were gummy with matter, and their feces flung off their hides in knotted clumps, exposing panting flakes. One of them had collapsed against the barbed wire and seemed unable to right itself again, either too depleted or too sick. It's cruel, said Angela. I had to agree. It seemed positively sadistic, locking up these creatures without more than a few blades of grass to chew on, and battered tin bath of stagnant water to quench their thirst. Odd, isn't it? Said Ray. I've cut my foot. Jonathan was squatting at the top of one of the flatter boulders, peering at the underside of his right foot. There's glass on the beach, I said, exchanging a vacant stare with one of the sheep. They're so deadpan, said Ray. Nature's straight men. Curiously, they didn't look so unhappy with their condition. Their stares were philosophical. Their eyes said, I'm just a sheep. I don't expect you to like me, care for me, preserve me, except for your stomach's sake. There were no angry baas, no stamping of a frustrated hoof. Just 3 gray sheep waiting to die. Ray had lost interest in the business. He was wandering back down to the beach, kicking a can ahead of him. It rattled and skipped, reminding me of the stones. "We should let them free," said Angela. I ignored her. What was freedom in a place like this? She persisted. "Don't you think we should?" "No." "They'll die." "Somebody put them here for a reason." "But they'll die." "They'll die on the beach if we let them out. There's no food for them." "We'll feed them." "French toast and gin," suggested Jonathan, picking a sliver of glass from his soul. "We can't just leave them. It's not our business," I said. It was all getting boring. 3 sheep. Who cared if they lived or... I'd thought that about myself an hour earlier. We had something in common, the sheep and I. My head was aching. "They'll die," whined Angela for a 3rd time. "You're a stupid bitch," Jonathan told her. The remark was made without malice. He said it calmly as a statement of plain fact. I couldn't help grinning. "What?" She looked as though she'd been bitten. "Stupid bitch," he said again. B-I-T-C-H. Angela flushed with anger and embarrassment and turned on him. "You got us stuck here," she said, lip curling. The inevitable accusation, tears in her eyes, stung by his words. "I did it deliberately," he said, spitting on his fingers and rubbing saliva on the cut. "I wanted to see if we could leave you here. You're drunk, and you're stupid, but I'll be sober in the morning." The old lines still made their mark. Outstripped, Angela started down on the beach after Ray, musing to hold back her tears until she was out of sight. I almost felt some sympathy for her. She was, when it came down to it, verbal fisticuffs, easy meat. "You're a bastard when you want to be," I told Jonathan, who just looked at me glassy-eyed. "Better be friends, then I won't be a bastard to you." "You don't scare me." "I know." The mutton was staring at me again. I stared back. "Fucking sheep," he said. "They can't help it. If they had any decency, they'd slit their ugly fucking throats." "I'm going back to the boat. Ugly fuckers. Coming?" He took hold of my hand, fast, tight, and held it to his hand where he'd never let go, eyes on me suddenly. "Don't go. It's too hot up here. Stay. The stone's nice and warm. Lie down. They won't interrupt us this time." "You knew?" I said. "You mean Ray?" "Of course I knew. I thought we'd put on quite a little performance." He drew me close, hand up over my arm, like he was hauling in a rope. The smell of him brought back the galley, his frown, his muttered profession. "Love you." The quiet retreat. Deja vu. Still, what was there to do on a day like this but go round in the same dreary circle, like the sheep in the pen, round and round, breathe, sex, eat shit. The gin had gone to his groin. He tried his best, but he hadn't got hope. It was like trying to thread spaghetti. Exasperated, he rolled off me. "Fuck, fuck, fuck." Senseless word, once it was repeated. It had lost all its meaning, like everything else, signifying nothing. "It doesn't matter," I said. "Fuck off. It really doesn't." He didn't look at me, just stared down at his cock. If he'd had a knife in his hand at that moment, I think he'd have cut it off and laid it on the warm rock to shrine to sterility. I left him studying himself and walked back to the Emmanuel. Something odd struck me as I went, something I hadn't noticed before. The blue flies, instead of jumping ahead of me as I approached, just let themselves be trodden on, positively lethargic or suicidal. They sat on the hot stones and popped under my soles, their gaudy little lives going out like so many lights. The mist was disappearing at last, and as the air warmed up, the island unveiled its new disgusting trick, the smell. The fragrance was as wholesome as a room full of rotting peaches, thick and sickly. It came in through the pores as well as the nostrils like a syrup, and under the sweetness something else, rather less pleasant than peaches, fresh or rotten. A smell like an open drain clogged with old meat, like the gutter of a slaughterhouse, caked with suet and black blood. It was the seaweed, I assumed, although I'd never smelt anything to match the stench on any other beach. I was halfway back to the Emmanuel, holding my nose as I stepped over the bands of rotting weed, when I heard the noise of a little murder behind me. Jonathan's whoops of satanic glee almost drowned the pathetic voice of the sheep as it was killed, but I knew instinctively what the drugging bastard had done. I turned back, my heel pivoting on the slime. It was almost certainly too late to save one of the beasts, but maybe I could prevent him massacring the other 2. I couldn't see the pen. It was hidden behind the boulders, but I could hear Jonathan's triumphant yells and the thud-thud of his strokes. I knew what I'd see before it came into sight. The green-gray lawn had turned red. Jonathan was in the pen with the sheep. The 2 survivors were charging back and forth in rhythmical trot of panic, baaing in terror, while Jonathan stood over the 3rd sheep, erect now. The victim had partially collapsed, its stick-like frog legs buckled beneath it, its back legs rigid like with approaching death. Its bulk shuddered with nervous spasms, and its eyes showed more white than brown. The top of its skull had been almost entirely dashed to pieces, and the gray hash of the brain exposed, punctured by shards of its own bone, and pulped by the large, round stone that Jonathan was still wielding. Even as I watched, he brought the weapon down once more onto the sheep's brain pan. Globs of tissue flew off every direction, speckling me in hot matter and blood. Jonathan looked like some nightmare lunatic, which for that moment I suppose he was. His naked body, so recently white, was stained as a butcher's apron on a hard day's hammering at the abattoir. His face was more sheep's gore than Jonathan. The animal itself was dead. Its pathetic complaints had ceased completely. It keeled over rather comically, like a cartoon character, one of its ears snagging the wire. Jonathan watched it fall, his face a grin under the blood. Oh, that grin. It served so many purposes. Wasn't that the same smile he loved charmed women with? The same grin that spoke lechery and love? Now at last it put it to its true purpose, the gawping smile of the satisfied savage, standing over his prey with a stone in one hand and his manhood in the other. Then, slowly, the smile decayed and his senses returned. Jesus, he said, and from his abdomen a wave of revulsion climbed up his body. I could see it quite clearly, the way his gut rolled as a throb of nausea threw his head forward, pitching half-digested gin and toast over the grass. I didn't move. I didn't want to confront him, calm him, console him. He was simply beyond my help. I turned away. Frankie, he said through a throat of bile. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. There was nothing to be done for the sheep. It was dead and gone. All I wanted to do was run away from the little ring of stones and put the sight out of my head. Frankie! I began to walk as fast as I was able over such tricky terrain, back down towards the beach and over the relative sanity of the Emmanuel. The smell was stronger now, coming up out the ground towards my face in filthy waves. Horrible island, vile, sticking, insane island. All I thought was hate as I stumbled across the weed and the filth. The Emmanuel wasn't far off. Then, a little pattering of pebbles like before, I stopped balancing uneasily on the sleek dome of a stone and looked to my left where even now one of the pebbles was rolling to a halt. As it stopped, another larger pebble, fully 6 inches across, seemed to move spontaneously from its resting place and roll down the beach, striking its neighbors and beginning another exodus towards the sea. I frowned. The frown made my head buzz. Was there some sort of animal, a crab maybe, under the beach, moving the stones? Or was it in the heat that in some way twitched them into life? Again, a bigger stone. I walked on, while behind the rattle and patter continued one little sequence, coming close upon another to make an almost seamless percussion. I began, without real focus or explanation, to be afraid. Angela and Ray were sunning themselves on the deck of the Emmanuel. Another couple of hours before we can start to get the bitch off her backside, he said, squinting as he looked up at me. I thought he meant Angela at first, then he realized he was talking about floating in the boat to sea again. May as well get some sun, he smiled wanly at me. Yes. Angela was either asleep or ignoring me. Whichever it was, it suited me fine. I slumped down on the sun deck at Ray's feet and let the sun soak into me. The specks of blood had dried in my skin like tiny scabs. I picked them off idly and listened to the noise of the stones and the slop of the sea. Behind me, pages were being turned. I glanced round. Ray, never able to lie still for very long, was flicking through a library book on the head bridges he brought from home. I looked up at the sun. My mother always said it burned a hole in the back of your eye to look straight into the sun, but it was hot and alive up there. I wanted to look into its face. There was a chill in me. I don't know where it had come from, a chill that my gut and in between my legs that wouldn't go away. Maybe I would have to burn it away by looking at the sun. Some way along the beach I glimpsed Jonathan tiptoeing down towards the sea. From that distance, the mixture of blood and white skin made him look like some piebald freak. He'd stripped off his shorts and he was crouching at the sea's edge to wash off the sheep. Then Ray's voice very quietly. "Oh, God," he said in such an understated way that I knew that the news couldn't be brilliant. "What is it?" "I found out where we are." "Good." "No, not good." "Why? What's wrong?" I sat upright, turning to him. "It's here in the book. There's a paragraph on this place." Angela opened one eye. "Well," she said. "It's not just an island. It's a burial mound." The chill in between my legs fed upon itself and grew gross. The sun wasn't hot enough to warm me that deep, where I should be hottest. I looked away from Ray along the beach again. Jonathan was still washing, splashing water up on his chest. The shadows of the stones suddenly seemed very black and heavy, their edges pressed down on the upturned faces of... Seeing me looking his way, Jonathan waved. "Can it be there are corpses under those stones, buried, face up to the sun, like holiday makers laid out on a Blackpool beach? The world is monochrome, sun and shadow, the white tops of stones and their black underbellies, life on top, death underneath." "Burial," said Angela. "What sort of burial?" "War dead," Ray answered. Angela. What, you mean like Vikings or something? World War I, World War II, soldiers from torpedo troop ships, sailors washed up, brought down here by the Gulf Stream. Apparently the current funnels them through the straits and washes them up into the beaches of the islands around here. Washes them up, said Angela. That's what it says. Not any longer, though. I'm sure the occasional fisherman gets buried here still, Ray replied. Jonathan had stood up, staring out into sea, the blood off his body. His hand shaded his eyes as he looked out over the blue-gray water, and I followed his gaze as I followed his finger. 100 yards out, that seal or whale or whatever it was had returned, lolling in the water. Sometimes, as it turned, it threw up like a fin, like a swimmer's arm, beckoning. How many people were buried? Asked Angela nonchalantly. She seemed completely unperturbed by the fact that we were sitting on a grave. Hundreds, probably. Hundreds. It just says many dead. It's a book. And do they put them in coffins? How should I know? What else could it be, this godforsaken mound but a cemetery? I looked at the island with new eyes, as though I'd just recognized it for what it was. Now I had a reason to despise its humpy back, its sordid beach, the smell of peaches. I wonder if they buried them all over, mused Angela, or just at the top of the hill where we found the sheep. Probably just the top, out of the way of the water. Yes, they'd probably had too much of water, their poor green faces picked by fish, their uniforms rotted, their dog tags encrusted with algae. What deaths, and worse, what journeys after death, squads of yellow corpses along the Gulf Stream to this bleak landfall. I saw them in my mind's eye, the bodies of the soldiers, subject to every whim of the tide, borne backwards and forwards in a slush of rollers until a casual limb snagged on a rock, and the sea lost possession of them. With each receding wave uncovered, sodden and jellied brine, spat out by the sea to stink a while and be stripped by gulls. I had a sudden, morbid desire to walk up on the beach again, armed with this knowledge, kicking over the pebbles in the hope of turning over a bone or two. As the thought formed, my body made the decision for me. I was standing. I was climbing off the Emmanuel. Where are you off to? Said Angela. Jonathan, I murmured, and set foot on the mound. The stench was clearer now. That was the accrued odor of the dead. Maybe drowned men still got buried here, as Ray had suggested, slotted under this pile of stones. The unwary yachtsmen, the careless swimmer, their faces wiped off with water. At the feet of the beach, flies were less sluggish than they'd been. Instead of waiting to be killed, they jumped and buzzed ahead of my steps with a new enthusiasm for life. Jonathan was not to be seen. His shorts were still on the stones at the water's edge, but he'd disappeared. I looked out to see nothing, no bobbing head, no lolling, beckoning something. I called his name. His voice seemed to excite the flies. They rose and seeding clouds. Jonathan didn't reply. I began to walk along the margin of the sea, my feet sometimes caught by an idle wave, as often as not left untouched. I realized I hadn't told Angela and Ray about the dead sheep. Maybe that was a secret between us four, Jonathan, myself, and the two survivors in the pen. Then I saw him, a few yards ahead, his chest white, wide and clean, every speck of blood washed off. A secret it is, then, I thought. Where have you been? I called to him. Walking it off, he called back. What off? Too much gin, he grinned. I returned the smile spontaneously. He said he'd love me in the galley. That counted for something. Behind him, a rattle of skipping stones. He was no more than 10 yards from me now, shamelessly naked as he walked. His gait was sober. The tattle of stones suddenly seemed rhythmical. It was no longer the random series of notes as one pebble struck another. It was a beat, a sequence of repeated sounds, a tick-tap pulse. No accident. Intention. Not chance. Purpose. Not stone. Thought. Behind stone. With stone. Carrying stone. Jonathan, now close, was bright. His skin was almost luminous with sun on it, thrown into relief by the darkness behind him. Wait. What darkness? The stone mounted the air like a bird, defying gravity, a blank black stone disengaged from the earth. It was the size of a baby, a whistling baby, and it grew behind Jonathan's head as it shimmered down the air towards him. The beach had been flexing its muscles, tossing small pebbles down the sea, all the time strengthening its will to rise this boulder off the ground and fling it at Jonathan. It swelled behind him, murderous in its intention, but my throat had no sound to make worthy of my fright. Was it deaf? His grin broke open again. He thought the horror of my face was a jibe at his nakedness. I realized. He doesn't understand. The stone sheared off the top of his head, from the middle of his nose upwards, leaving his mouth still wide, his tongue rooted in blood, and flinging the rest of his beauty towards me in a cloud of wet, red dust. The upper part of his head was split to on the face of the stone, its expression intact as it swooped towards me. I half fell, and it screamed past me, veering off towards the sea. Once over the water, the assassin seemed to lose its will somehow and faltered in the air before plunging into the waves. At my feet, blood, a trail that led to where Jonathan's body lay, the open edge of his head towards me, its machinery plain for the sky to see. I was still not screaming, though for sanity's sake I had to unleash the terror suffocating me. Somebody must hear me, hold me, take me away and explain to me before the skipping pebbles found their rhythm again. Or worse, before the mines below the beach, unsatisfied with murder by proxy, rolled away their gravestones and rose to kiss me themselves. But the scream would not come. All I could hear was the patter of stones to my right and left. They intend to kill us all for invading their sacred ground, stoned to death like heretics. Then a voice. For Christ's sakes! A man's voice, but not Ray's. He seemed to have appeared from out of thin air, a short, broad man standing at the sea's edge. In one hand a bucket, and under his arm a bundle of coarsely cut hay. Food for the sheep, I thought, through a jumble of half-formed words. Food for sheep. He stared at me, then down at Jonathan's body, his old eyes wild. What's gone on? He said. The Gaelic accent was thick. In the name of Christ, what's gone on? I shook my head. It seemed loose on my neck, almost as though I might shake it off. Maybe I pointed to the sheep pen, maybe not. Whatever the reason, he seemed to know what I was thinking and began to climb the beach towards the crown of the island, dropping bucket and bundle as well. Half blind with confusion, I followed, but before I could reach the boulders, he was out on their shadow again, his face suddenly shining with panic. Who did that? Jonathan, I replied. I cast a hand towards the corpse, not daring to look back at him. The man cursed in Gaelic and stumbled out of the shelter of the boulders. What have you done? He yelled at me. My Christ, what have you done? Killing their gifts. Just sheep, I said. In my head, the instant of Jonathan's decapitation was playing over and over again, a loop of slaughter. They demand it, don't you see, or they rise. Who rise? I said, knowing, seeing the stones shift. All of them, put away without grief or mourning, but they've got the sea in them, in their heads. I knew what he was talking about. It was quite plain to me. Suddenly, the dead were here, as we knew, under the stones, but they had the rhythm of the sea in them, and they wouldn't lie down. So to placate them, these sheep were tethered to a pen to be offered up to their wills. Did the dead eat mutton? No, it wasn't food they wanted. It was the gesture of recognition, as simple as that. Drowned, he was saying, all drowned. Then the familiar patter began again, the drumming of stones, which grew, without warning, into an ear-splitting thunder, as though the entire beach was shifting. And under the cacophony, three other sounds, splashing, screaming, and wholesale destruction. I turned to see a wave of stones rising into the air on the other side of the island. Again, the terrible screams, wrung from a body that was being buffeted and broken. And they were after the Emmanuel. After Ray, I started to run in the direction of the boat, the beach rippling beneath my feet. Behind me I could hear the boots of the sheep, feeder of the stones. As we ran, the noise of the assault became louder. Stones danced in the air like fat birds, blocking the sun, before plunging down to strike at some unseen target. Maybe the boat, maybe flesh itself. Angela's tormented screams had ceased. I rounded the beachhead a few steps ahead of the sheep feeder, and the Emmanuel came into sight. It and its human contents were beyond all hopes of salvation. The vessel was being bombarded by endless ranks of stones, all sizes and shapes. Its hull was smashed, its windows, mast, deck shattered. Angela lay sprawled on the remains of the sun deck, quite obviously dead. The fury of the hail hadn't stopped, however. The stones beat a tattoo on the remaining structure of the hull and thrashed at the lifeless bulk of Angela's body, making it bob up and down as though a current were being passed through it. Ray was nowhere to be seen. I screamed then, and for a moment it seemed there was a lull in the thunder, a brief respite in the attack. Then it began again, wave after wave of pebbles and rocks rising off the beach and flinging themselves at their senseless target. They would not be content, it seemed, until the Emmanuel was reduced to flotsam and jetsam, and Angela's body was in small enough pieces to accommodate a shrimp's palate. The ship feeder took hold of my arm in a grip so fierce it stopped the blood flow from my hand. Come on, he said. I heard his voice but did nothing. I was waiting for Ray's face to appear, or to hear his voice calling my name. But there was nothing, just the barrage of the stones. He was dead in the ruins of the boat somewhere, smashed to smithereens. The sheep feeder was dragging me now, and I was following him back over the beach. The boat, he was saying. We can get away in my boat. The idea of escape seemed ludicrous. The island had us on its back. We were its objects utterly. But I followed, slipping and sliding over the sweaty rocks, plowing through the tangle of seaweed back the way we'd come. On the other side of the island was his poor hope of life, a rowing boat, dragged up on a shingle, an inconsequential walnut shell of a boat. We would go to sea like that, like the three men in a sieve. He dragged me unresisting toward our deliverance. With every step I became more certain that the beach would suddenly rise up and stone us to death, maybe make a wall of itself, a tower even, when we were within a single step of safety. It could play any game it liked, any game at all, but then maybe the dead didn't like games. Games were all about gambles, and the dead had already lost. Maybe the dead act only in the arid certainty of mathematicians. He half threw me onto the boat and began to push it out into the thick tide. No walls or stones began to prevent our escape. No towers appeared, no slaughtering hail. Even the attack of the Emmanuel had ceased. Had they sated themselves on 3 victims, or was it the presence of the sheep-feeder, an innocent or servant of these willful dead, would protect me from their tantrums? The rowing boat was off the shingle. We bobbed a little on the backs of few lumps of waves until we were deep enough for the oars, and then we were pulling away from the shore, and the Savior was sitting opposite me, rowing for all he was worth, a dew of fresh sweat on his forehead multiplying with every pull. The beach receded. We were being set free. The sheep-feeder seemed to relax a little. He gazed down at the swill of dirty water in the bottom of the boat and drew in a half a dozen deep breaths, then looked up at me. His wasted face drained of expression. One day it had to happen, he said, his voice low and heavy. Somebody would spoil the way we lived, break the rhythm. It was almost soporific, the hauling of the oars forward and back. I wanted to sleep, to wrap myself up in the tarpaulin I was sitting on and forget. Behind us the beach was a distant line. I couldn't see the Emmanuel. Where are we going? I said. Back to Tyre, he said. We'll see what's to be done there. Find some way to make amends, to help them sleep soundly again. Do they eat the sheep? What good is food to the dead? No, they have no need for mutton. They take the beast as a gesture of remembrance. Remembrance, I nodded. It's our way of mourning them. He stopped rowing, too heartsick to finish his explanation, too exhausted to do anything, but let the tide carry us home. A blank moment passed. Then the scratching. A mouse noise, no more. A scrabbling at the underside of the boat like a man's tickling the planks to be let in. Not one man, many. The sound of their entreaties multiplied, the sound dragging of rotted cuticles across the wood. In the boat we didn't move, we didn't speak, we didn't believe. Even as we heard the worst, we didn't believe the worst. A splash off to starboard, I turned up, and he was coming towards me, rigid in the water, borne up by my unseen puppeteers like a figurehead. It was Ray, his body covered in killing bruises and cuts, stoned to death, then brought like a gleeful mascot, like proof of power to spook us. It was almost as though we were walking on his water, his feet just hidden by the swell, his arms hanging loosely on the side as he was hauled towards the boat. I looked at his face, lacerated and broken, one eye almost closed, the other smashed from its orbit. 2 yards from the boat, the puppeteers let him sink back into the sea, where he disappeared in a swirl of pink water. Your companion? Said the sheep-feeder. I nodded. He must have fallen into the sea from the stern of the Emmanuel. Now that was like them, a drowned man. They had already claimed him as their plaything. So they did like games. After all, they hauled him from the beach like children come to fetch a playmate, eager that he should join the horseplay. The scratching had stopped. Ray's body had disappeared altogether. Not a murmur off the pristine sea, just the slop of the waves against the oars of the boat. I pulled at the oars. Row! I screamed at the sheep-feeder. Row, or they'll kill us. He seemed resigned to whatever they had in mind to punish us with. He shook his head and spat into the water. Beneath his floating phlegm something moved, and the deep, pale forms rolled and somersaulted, too far down to be clearly seen. Even as I watched, they came floating up towards us, their sea-corrupted faces better defined with every fathom they rose, their arms outstretched to embrace us. A shoal of corpses, the dead in dozens, crab-cleaned and fish-picked, their remaining flesh scarcely sitting on their bones. The boat rocked gently as their hands reached up to touch it. The look of resignation on the sheep-feeder's face didn't falter for a moment as the boat was shaken backwards and forwards, at first gently, then so violently we were beaten about like dolls. They meant to capsize us, and there was no help for it. A moment later, the boat tipped over. The water was icy, far colder than I'd anticipated, and it took my breath away. I'd always been a fairly strong swimmer. My strokes were confident as I began to swim from the boat, cleaving through the white water. The sheep-feeder was less lucky. Like many men who live at the sea, he apparently couldn't swim. Without issuing a cry or prayer, he sank like a stone. What did I hope? That 4 was enough, that I could be left with them a current of safety? Whatever hopes of escape I had, they were short-lived. I felt a soft, oh so very soft, brushing of my ankles and my feet, almost a caress. Something broke surface, briefly close to my head. I glimpsed a gray back as a large fish. The touch on my ankle had become a grasp. A pulpy hand, mushed by so long in the water, had a hold of me and inexorably began to claim me for the sea. I gulped what I knew to be my last breath of air. As I did so, Ray's head bobbed no more than a yard from me. I saw his wounds in clinical detail. The water-cleansed cuts were ugly flaps of white tissue with a gleam of bone at their core. The loose eye had been washed away by now. His hair, flattened to the skull, no longer distinguished the bald patch at his crown. The water closed over my head. My eyes were open, and I saw my hard-earned breath flashing past my face in a display of silver bubbles. Ray was beside me, consoling, attentive. His arms floated over his head as though he were surrendering. The pressure of the water distorted his face, puffing his cheeks out and spilling threads of severed nerves from his empty eye socket like the tentacles of a tiny squid. I let it happen. I opened my mouth and felt it fill with cold water. Salt burned my sinuses. The cold stabbed behind my eyes. I felt the brine burning down my throat, a rush of eager water where water shouldn't go, flushing air into my tubes and cavities till my system was overwhelmed. Below me, the corpses, their hair swaying loosely in the current, hugged my legs. Their heads lolled and danced on rotted ropes of neck muscle, and I pawed at their hands, and their flesh came up the bone-gray, lace-edged pieces. Their loving grip didn't falter. They wanted me. Oh, how dearly they wanted me. Ray was holding me too, wrapping me up, pressing his face to mine. There was no purpose in the gesture, I suppose. He didn't know or feel or love or care. And I, losing my life with every second, succumbing to the sea, absolutely couldn't take pleasure in the intimacy that I'd longed for. Too late for love, the sunlight was already a memory. Was it that the world was going out, darkening towards the edges as I died? Or were they now so deep the sun couldn't penetrate so far? Panic and terror had left me. My heart seemed not to beat at all. My breath didn't come and go in anguished bursts at all. A kind of peace was on me. Now, the grip of my companions relaxed, and the gentle tide had its way with me, a rape of the body, a ravaging of skin and muscle, gut, eye, sinus, tongue, brain. Time had no place here. The days may have passed into weeks, I couldn't know. The keels of boats glided over, and maybe we looked up from our rock hovels on occasion and watched them pass. A ringed finger was trailed in the water, a splashless puddle clove the sky, a fishing line trailed a worm, signs of life. Maybe the same hour as I died, or maybe a year later, the current sniffs me out of my rock and has some mercy. I am twitched from amongst the sea anemones and given to the tide. Ray is with me. His time, too, has come. The sea change has occurred. There is no turning back for us. Relentlessly the tide bears us, sometimes floating, bloated decks for gulls, sometimes half sunk and nibbled by fish, bears us towards the island. We know the surge of the shingle and hear, without ears, the rattle of the stones. The sea has long since washed the plate clean of its leavings. Angela, the Emmanuel, and Jonathan are gone. Only we drowned belong here, face up, under the stones, soothed by the rhythm of tiny waves and the absurd incomprehension of sheep. And that was... Sorry, that was a really hard read for me. Personally, I'd only read it once before, in my head, obviously, like you normally do. So I didn't have to say a certain name that I have now had to say so many times that I have to cleanse my room. So having to say it out loud that many times was a challenge. So I apologize for the reading being choppy today. But that was not a fun read for me. Personally, just personal issues. That was Scape-Goats. Personal issues. Next week is Human Remains. And then we are done with Volume 3. So, this is actually an important, just kind of housekeeping thing. My first 3 copies are the U.S. Paperback, like the kind that you would find at the grocery store, or like the dime store and the so that's my first 3. And then I have the hardbacks, the American hardbacks of 4 and 5. And then I have a paperback, which is very, very fragile, of 6, but it's the American version, so it does not contain the final story of Books of Blood. So, if anyone has any tips on where to get a British copy that is somewhat affordable, I mean, all of these I had stumbled across when I would go to Half Price Books and just go straight to look for Barker books. That's usually, except for this one. I'll get to that story later. But obviously, since everything moved online, like this one's been recently added to our collection from an online store. So, yes, I'm going to be switching to hardbacks after we stop volume 3. And then I still need to find a complete volume 6. But like I said, the complete volume 6 is a UK copy. So if anyone wants to help me on that search, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for reading with me, and like I said, again, I am so sorry that this video is going to be choppy, but my mental health cannot handle having to say a certain name so many times. And I'm going to go cleanse my room now. Thank you. I'll see you next week.